So, can we actually trust the Bible? It's one of the biggest questions out there. Today, we're not going to talk about blind faith or feelings. Instead, we're going to look at this like detectives, okay? We're going to examine the evidence piece by piece and build a logical case.
All right, let's just start with a really basic question. If a God who created everything actually exists, does it really make sense that he'd just go silent? Or would you expect him to try and communicate, in a way that was clear, consistent, and could actually last? This one question kind of sets the stage for everything else. First off, you just got to look at how improbable this book even is. I mean, it was written over a span of 1,500 years. That's like someone starting a story back in the days of the Roman Empire and someone else finishing it today on their smartphone. We're talking over 40 different authors, kings, shepherds, fishermen, you name it, from 3 different continents, writing in 3 different languages. Which, leads to the big question. How on earth do you get one single unified message from all of that chaos? Just think about it. Different cultures, different centuries, different languages. You'd expect a total mess, right? A complete contradiction fest. But is that what we find? But here's the crazy part. That's not what you get. From Genesis all the way to Revelation, there's this one consistent theme that weaves through everything. It's a single story. God is holy, humanity is separated from him by sin, and a Redeemer is coming to fix that problem. That one idea is the thread holding the whole library together. Okay, fine. So that's the original message. But what about today? How do we know it hasn't been corrupted? This is probably the number one thing you hear, right? The whole game of telephone idea, where the message just gets warped and changed over time. It's a really fair question, so let's actually look at it. See, that whole game of telephone idea, it actually falls apart when you look at how it worked. In that game, you've got one single line of information. There's no way to check for mistakes, so it's guaranteed to get messed up. The Bible's transmission was the exact opposite. It wasn't one line. It was an explosion of thousands of copies spreading everywhere. This created tons of different lines of evidence that could all be checked against each other. It wasn't a system of corruption, it was a system of verification. And when I say an explosion of copies, I am not kidding. For just the New Testament, we have over 25,000 ancient manuscripts. To put that in perspective for you, the next closest ancient work, Homer's Iliad, has less than 2,000. The amount of manuscript evidence for the Bible is just in a totally different league. So let me ask you a question. Just think about it. If you have 25,000 copies of a document and one copyist makes a little mistake, is that mistake harder to find, or is it way, way easier? It's way easier, right? The errors stick out like a sore thumb when you compare them to all the others. So here's the key takeaway. Having all those manuscripts doesn't make the Bible less reliable. It's the very thing that makes it more reliable. It lets us know with incredible certainty what the original said. And that brings us right back to where we started. If God was going to reveal himself, wouldn't it make sense that he'd also have a plan to preserve that revelation? Okay, now let's get into something really wild. Predictive prophecy. Take the book of Daniel. It was written centuries before these things happened, and yet it lays out the exact succession of world empires, from Babylon to Medo-Persia, then Greece, and finally Rome. It's like reading a history book written in advance. And it wasn't just about big empires either. There are literally hundreds of prophecies from different authors over hundreds of years that all point to one coming figure, a Messiah. And they get so specific, they pinpoint his birthplace, Bethlehem. They said he'd be rejected by his own people. And they gave these strange, contradictory clues about his death, that he'd be pierced and killed, but would somehow end up victorious over death itself. So, what are the odds of all that happening by accident in one person? Well, people have done the math. The probability of just 8 of these prophecies being fulfilled by one man is 1 in 100 quadrillion. That's a 1 with 17 zeros after it. I mean, we can't even picture a number that huge. So you have to ask yourself, when you're looking at odds like that, is that just a crazy, unbelievable coincidence? Or is it evidence of a plan?
You see how this all connects? The unified story, the perfectly preserved text, these impossible prophecies. Every line of evidence we've looked at points to one single person in all of human history, Jesus Christ. He's the one the whole story says is the answer. All right, let's switch gears for a second. Let's forget theology and just talk about plain old history. Pretty much every serious historian, religious or not, agrees on a few basic facts. A man named Jesus of Nazareth lived. He was a teacher in first century Judea. And he was executed by the Romans, by crucifixion. These aren't really points of faith, they're just accepted history.
So, look, his life and death, that's not really the debate. The real mystery, the question that changed everything, is what happened after he was executed?
What was the one claim that just exploded out of Jerusalem right after he died? It wasn't some deep, new philosophy. It was a simple, bold statement from his followers. They just said, "We saw him, alive. Not as a ghost, not a warm feeling in their hearts, but physically risen from the dead."
And this is where you have to be a bit of a psychologist. How do you explain the change in his followers? One minute, they're hiding behind locked doors, totally terrified, having run away to save their own skin. And the next minute, they're out in public, risking everything to preach that he's alive. What causes that kind of transformation?
Which leads to the ultimate question. Think about it. People will die for what they think is true all the time. But who willingly suffers and dies for something they know is a lie they just made up themselves? It just doesn't make any sense. The complete turnaround of the disciples is a huge piece of evidence that something must have happened.
Okay, so let's just put all the pieces on the table. We have a book with an impossible unity, a text that's been preserved like no other. We have prophecies that pinpoint a specific historical person. We know that person lived and died. And then we have eyewitness claims of his resurrection that sparked a movement of people completely transformed from cowards into martyrs.
You know, the job of any good investigator is to find the one explanation that fits all the evidence, right? So the question we have to ask is, what is the single best explanation that accounts for every single piece of this puzzle? What theory has the fewest holes?
Because look, if the best explanation is that the Bible is telling the truth, then we have to face what its main character actually said. And Jesus didn't just suggest he was a good teacher, he made this wild, exclusive claim. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And that leaves us with one last question, the one that really matters. This isn't just a thought experiment. If the case holds up, if God really did speak, if the message is true, and if Jesus is who he said he was, then the question moves from, is this true, to a question for you, personally. What are you going to do with Jesus?